Morning. This is John from the Springs Mennonite Church. Happy to be with you again today. It's been a good week so far. Expect it to be a good week the rest of the week. I hope that's the way you look at it. Life is full of wonderful opportunities to see things that we never imagined were there. We just take the time to look. And so here's a story I'd like to share with you. Some good news, some encouraging words from the book of John, chapter 6. We find this story here. That evening, Jesus' disciples went down to the shore to wait for him. But as darkness fell and Jesus still hadn't come back, they got into the boat and headed across the lake towards Capernaum. Soon a gale swept down upon them, and the sea grew very rough. They had rowed 3 or 4 miles when suddenly they saw Jesus walking on the water toward the boat. And they were terrified. But he called out to them, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." Then they were eager to let him in the boat, and immediately they arrived at their destination. This is a really neat story. It's a story about Jesus and his disciples, and it's a story about you and me. But before we get to the second part, let's look at the first one. Jesus had finished his work and it was getting late, and he told the crew, head on to the other side. So they waited a little while for him. He didn't show up, so they figured they better do what he said. They headed out. 3 or 4 miles into the journey, this huge storm came up. Now, the Sea of Galilee is known for sudden storms. Something about the topography, the mountains around it, and the elevation, and the way the winds go. And you can have a perfectly calm sea, and then within a few minutes, it'd be a real rip snorter of a storm. And evidently, that's what happened to these guys. Now, but you also have to remember, these guys are not new on the boat. Some of these guys have been fishermen their whole lives on this lake. They know the lake. They know what to do. They know how to navigate the storms. But evidently, this storm was even worse than the ones they typically saw. It must have been, or they wouldn't have been so shook up about it. So as they're fighting this storm, according to the story here, Jesus comes up to them. Now remember, he said, "Wait for me, I'll be there." And they took off, and he comes anyway. But they see him walking across the water. That had to have been a sight. If I'd have been there, I probably would have been shaken up. No, I know I would have been shaken up. You just don't expect to see somebody walking across the top of the water. It just doesn't happen. That doesn't compute, as some say, in our today's world. But that's exactly what happened to the disciples. And while they were in the midst of fighting this storm, and then see Jesus coming up to them on top of the water, it says they were terrified. They weren't just scared, they were terrified. I don't know if you've ever been terrified before. The word means you find yourself in a position where you have absolutely no control and no idea of what's going to happen. You are absolutely convinced you're going to die. Now, I've never been in that spot. I've been in some uncontrolled situations, probably you have, but I've never been places to be terrified like this. But they were. No fault of their own. They're just being human beings, just like you and me. And so as Jesus comes towards them, he calls out to them. You see, he called out to them. They didn't call out to him. He made the first step. He made the first movement towards them. And he knows what's going on with them. They don't know what's going on with him, but he knows what's going on with them. And he says to them, "Don't be afraid. I'm here." Well, at that point, they were eager for him to get into the boat, and I don't blame them. If I'd have been there, I'd have done the same thing. But it also says that as immediately got in the boat, the storm stopped and they got to their destination. So, what does that say to you and me? You and I have storms in our lives, some big ones. Maybe not as big as this one, maybe even bigger than this one, to where you think you're gonna die. So, what do you do? Well, this story teaches us that we need to look for Jesus because he's already here. We don't have to wait for him to show up. We don't have to hope he shows up. We don't have to beg him to show up. I am here, is what he says. And he says the same thing to you and to me. When we get into a situation that we don't know what to do. It's okay. That's happened to me. I got some news for you. It's going to happen to you again and again and probably again some more. That's just life. We are not in control of life. Heck, we're barely in control of ourselves, in spite of what most people think. But yet, in the midst of those difficulties, those storms, those times when we're terribly afraid, there's a solution. His name is Jesus. Oh, I don't mean that your circumstances are going to immediately transform like this story says. Some will. I've seen that. I've known people who've done that. Some will. That's an absolute possibility. But some don't. And even if they don't, Jesus is still here. He'll guide you through the difficulties. Just like these disciples, they thought they were alone in that boat, subject to their own skill and abilities, and apparently it wasn't working too well. But they weren't alone. Jesus was coming up to them. Just as fast as they lost confidence, Jesus was arriving on the scene. And he said, I'm here. Do not be afraid. And if you look in the Bible, you'll find that phrase is mentioned many, many, many times. Whatever your situation in life, whatever you're facing even right now, do not be afraid. And for those who love the Lord and walk with him, that's a guarantee and a promise that is unbreakable. But we have to trust him. So I hope today you will trust God, trust the Lord in every situation you're in, big or small. And I hope you do the same tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the day after and so on and so forth. Because you can count on God. You can count on the Lord. Absolutely. That's not my promise. That's his. So thanks for listening. Hope you have a wonderful day. Really do. Hope it's terrific. Take care of yourself. Be safe. God bless you, and we'll see you again.